Okay. So first of all, it's just kind of a basic thing, is we have to think about why is money important, right? Well, imagine, you know how like at church they may pass a collection plate? Imagine if someone put eggs or a chicken or milk in the collection plate, right? That's really weird. Money is a means of exchange, right? It makes life simple, right? It makes life easy. Did the coin come out?
No, it's a dime.
Oh, there was a dime stuck in there too. Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Fine.
Assuming,
Yeah, no, this isn't Chinese.
Your dime. Excellent.
So, but the idea is that this is money. It makes transactions easier. Imagine going to the bookstore to buy your books, and you have to carry a bunch of wheat with you to pay for your books, right? It's really a pain in the neck to do that. So money allows for exchanges to happen very easily. Also, money doesn't go bad. Imagine if the government collects taxes in grain, and then mice eat the taxes, or it goes bad, right? Do you want to lose your fortune because of mice? Right. So money is something that's safe, it's agreed upon means of exchange. It's a really good thing. And the Qing understood this, and they concentrated on producing more copper cash. What I'm handing around there is copper cash, right? It's just a coin. And the reason it has the hole in the center is so you could put it on a string. Because to do anything usually took several hundred pieces of copper cash. Right? They're not particularly valuable, which is why I could buy it for $2.70. There's not that much copper in there, and there are literally millions of coins like that. They're not worth much. But the Qing want to make sure they have plenty of money to do this, so that people can pay their taxes and can transact all this important business. So the Qing understand the importance of money. They want to encourage this. It makes their life easier because they can have people pay taxes in money rather than grain, which can go bad. In addition, the Qing will be good at making sure that there's adequate supplies of silver. I don't want to go into this because it's very complex, but you may recall that one of the problems that the comic book talked about was that the Ming did not have enough silver. Right? They had trouble getting enough silver, there wasn't enough money in the economy, so the Qing are going to be fortunate that there will be adequate supplies of silver, and they're going to do their best to make sure they have lots of copper. Now here's what's really complex, and just bear with me because this is difficult to follow, but it is important. If you're a peasant, and you sell your crops, usually all you get is copper coins. You don't sell enough to get silver money. Right? They have two official currencies, copper and silver. I'm a peasant, I go sell my I go sell my grain, I get paid in copper. But when my taxes are assessed, and when I pay my taxes, that is paid in silver. Right? That is paid in silver. Part of the reason for this, you've got to think about this, the government is dealing with huge amounts of money. So they can't have all these copper coins. They can't have people paying in copper coins. It's just too much. So they need people to pay in something that's worth more. So everything is assessed in silver rather than copper. Now there is a fixed exchange rate between copper and silver to try and make sure things are fair. Later on, this will go all wonky. We'll talk more about this later. Wonky, by the way, is a historical term. This will get all messed up later on. But for now, I just want you to understand, you've got this system of two currencies, copper and silver. Peasants usually only work at copper. They don't make enough money to get paid in silver. But when taxes are assessed, it's based on the value of silver. Right? So they may have to pay 5,000 copper coins as taxes, but the value is assessed in silver. This will become really important later on, but just for now, keep it in mind. Peasants pay in copper, they pay taxes in silver. And I hand around the coin. These are examples of silver coins. Usually Chinese used an ounce coin called a tael. Right, so they use these coins that are in ounces. Now, to give you some more numbers, to give you an idea of government revenues, about 3/4 of all government revenue came from the land tax. The vast majority of their money comes from the land tax. So this is why we call China an agricultural country. Most government revenues come from the land tax. This is why whenever there's serious tax reform, it's always focusing on land. Get the gentry to pay up, basically, because that's where we can get most money. Salt tax was about 12%. This was like the only kind of commerce they really taxed that much was salt. Curiously, they taxed the movement of salt. You didn't pay tax when you bought salt or sold salt or produced salt. You pay tax when you move salt around to sell. Customs, which are like import taxes, was about 8%. Then they had some miscellaneous taxes for the rest. But a couple things about this. First of all, you can see it's very much focused on agriculture. You can also see that they undertax trade. I just talked about how there was all this marketization going on. Chinese people were buying and selling on the market. And the Chinese government, for whatever reason, never really successfully taxed trade, never really tapped that wealth. So they're going to, even though you have this, basically in a sense, the economy is developing, but the government's not keeping up. Right? The economy is developing, but the government's not keeping up and taxing that wealth. There is difficulty in collecting taxes, particularly land tax, especially in the South, because of the gentry. Right? Remember, the gentry, the government needs the gentry to help them rule. But they're not, in order to keep up that partnership, they're not allowed to push the gentry too far. And so, for example, people will basically sometimes just be flat out corrupt. The magistrate will not ask the gentry to pay taxes. Right? They'll make other people pay the gentry taxes for them, essentially. Right? There'll be a tax quota, they'll tax other people. And there's also a lot of false registration. Right? Sometimes it's very difficult just to figure out who owns what piece of land. If you don't know who owns the land, how can you get them to pay? So there's this consistent problem, especially in southern China. However, the key thing was, especially in the 18th century, the Qing had a lot of money. Their treasury was full. So they didn't want to push things, because why would you? If we've got enough money, why antagonize the gentry who help us to govern, to get more money? Right? If we already have enough money, why make the gentry angry when we need them to help us rule? So, people in history can't predict the future. They don't know what's going to happen. So from our perspective, we may look back and say, wow, they should have totally taxed the gentry. They need a stronger tax base because we know what's going to happen in China in the 19th century. But they don't know this in the 18th century. So I say, okay, we're not going to push the gentry. I said this, though, is going to cause problems later. This is a Chinese coin. And just one thing I think is cool, especially for those of you who are interested in banking and currency, the Chinese characters, are you able to pronounce these for me, Tianyu? Can you read them okay?
Tong, Bao, Guang, Shi.
Right, that's a little bit different from the one I handed out, but a lot of these coins say, this means circulating money.
Yeah.
Right. On the coin I handed out, it says always normal, meaning this coin is worth what it's worth. Right? It's not worth less than that. Right? So we can always trust it. This is a little bit different. Do you know that? I know this is like glorious. I don't know this. Oh, that's the emperor.
Yeah.
It's the Guangxu emperor.
Yeah,
Okay.
Guangxu.
It's the name. Okay. And the coin I'm handing out, it says this coin is circulating coin. It's always worth the same. It's the equivalent of "In God We Trust," which is on American coins. There are some problems, though, in Chinese law, and we saw this previously. And this is going to hurt China's economic development. Right? This is going to prevent it from becoming more modern. And that's the issue of property rights. This is going back to that modern China book. But I thought he just said this so well, I should just share the whole thing with you. The absence of commercial and civil codes introduced an element of uncertainty into private ownership. China did not have well-developed business law during this time period. That's very important, right? Because what happens then, you know how in the United States, like if there's a contract dispute, you could just go to like a court that will help you deal with that? In China, there was no such thing as business law. So everything fell under criminal law. So imagine you have a contract dispute, you have to make it into a criminal case, which involves torture. Right? You traditionally in China, when you interrogated someone who was not gentry, who was not a scholar official, you could torture them. In fact, you were supposed to. That was normal. So imagine that. You enter into a contract, you have a dispute. In order to sell the dispute, you have to be tortured. Not good, and that doesn't encourage business. So the Chinese had a problem. They didn't have well-developed commercial law or trade law. All those things you're learning in your business classes, they didn't have. And laws are good. They prevent conflict. Right? They help us know what rules we need to play by. Private property rights in Qing China were genuine and substantive, but enforcement was less reliable. So there were good laws about property rights, about who owned what, but it wasn't always there. It wasn't always enforced. Legally enforceable claims remained somewhat secondary to the political standing of the property holders. Faced with the fundamental possibility of arbitrary government confiscation that cannot be legally challenged, property holders tend to seek protection by wooing political power. What does this mean? Well, this is what it means. There's the law, but the law is not always applied. Remember the case of Wang San? Right? And how the guy that killed, several members of the same family, and the law was they should get his property, but he was protected by a powerful official. A powerful member of the gentry, so they didn't get anything. This is the same problem. What often, if I'm in a property dispute with someone, it's not going to follow the law. It's going to follow whoever has the most political power. Right? So if I'm a powerful member of the gentry, I can use that to expand and take over other people's land. and this is important to understand why peasants are often upset. If you're a peasant and you get in a legal dispute with a member of the gentry, you're probably going to lose, and people will take your land. Remember, this is key because the peasants will be angry, and it's peasants' anger that helps the communists to come to power later. So if you're someone who's a property owner, you're going to make sure that you have a close connection with the government, that you're good buddies. When the magistrate comes in, you're going to be the magistrate's friend. You're going to give him lots of gifts. And if you're a powerful official and you like stuff, you can just take it. And there's cases where there were like art collectors. Again, this is more for our art majors. If you were like an art collector, you didn't want to boast about your art collection, because sometimes the emperor would say, oh, I like that. You should give that to me as a gift. Right? So can you imagine that, right? The ruler can say, oh yes, I like your painting. You know, so sometimes the emperor like visited, people would hide their stuff, their best stuff, because they didn't want the emperor to see it and like it, because then he would say, oh, that's a very nice painting. And of course the response is, oh, would you like it, your highness? And of course the answer is yes. So despite elaborate and generally reliable informal arrangements for recording, protecting, and transferring rights to land and other material assets, the foundation of property rights in Imperial China depended on politics rather than law. So this is a problem. So in many ways, China's government, its market is developing. The economy is developing very well, but there's not the legal protections there. Right? There's not the property rights are not going to be well respected. And that's kind of an obstacle. Also, again, for our business people, this is, I think, especially those of you who are interested in banking, Dr. Chun, Lili Chun, right, from Nanjing, China, is a specialist in banking. This is very important also for us to understand. But the minute divisions of labor in traditional industries led to fragmentation. So again, you know, if you study business, how there's like an economy of scale, and how you want to bring together a lot of different, you know, if you want to build computers, ideally you would have control of different little companies that make everything that goes into building a computer. I think it's called vertical integration. Is that correct? Okay, yeah. So you want to do that. And doing that helped make huge American and British companies like Standard Oil and stuff like that. But in China, these industries were fragmented. They were small. They stayed small. They didn't ever become big during this time period. Every stage in the work process was relatively independent. And there was no overall coordination of the production process. So you had no big factory or big company organizing everything. The links in the chain of production were also mostly small units, family or small shops that did not command financial resources to systematically explore or invest in new technologies. Right? So think about, right? Doesn't every like a modern business has an R&D department, right? If you're a big company, you've got that. Chinese companies stay small. They're like family enterprises mostly. They never get that big, and that means they're not going to develop new products in the same way that you'll have in the West. Right? They're not going to undergo a scientific and industrial revolution because you don't have a concentration of money that would make that possible. Right? Think about Henry Ford, right? You got this wealthy businessman. He can invest in new ways of producing cars, which allows him to produce cars efficiently, more cheaply. There's no one in China to do that because business is too small.
And Dr. Rice, the peasants wouldn't want to take out loans a lot because most of the time when they take out loans, do that with the gentry. If they can't pay back their loans, the gentry will take their land.
Yeah, exactly. You don't usually borrow money to invest as much. You're right. While the late imperial state could have been expected to be able to requisition resources to push for innovation, it left economic affairs largely to themselves. Unlike in early modern Holland or England, there was also no formal market for public debt. So in other words, there's no like bond system. Again, if you're familiar with business, you know that if a country, so I think for example, lately, is it Greenwood? A local area wanted to sell bonds to help develop local infrastructure. Right? So, you know, local people could invest, could buy these bonds, and the county gets the money it needs to develop the local infrastructure. Governments do this. It gives them access to money that they need. China had no way to do this. So, you know, the Chinese government doesn't have a good way to borrow money. The only way they can get money is to tax it or just straight out take it. So, whereas Holland and England during this time period are developing ways of public debt so that their government can become more powerful. The lack of proper financial instruments for government or private borrowing additionally restrained institutional capacity and rendered the traditional state prone to fiscal predation or confiscation in times of budget shortfalls. Right? So basically there's no way the government can borrow money. If it needs money, it either has to raise taxes or just take people's stuff. Force the people to loan it money that it never plans on paying back. So while China has a developing economy, the government doesn't really interact with it very well. Right? The government doesn't figure out how to tax it. There's no development of this. There's no kind of infrastructure for developing new and better products and new methods of production and so forth. All these things, though, are happening in Europe. All these things are happening in Europe, and it's going to make the Europeans a lot stronger. And public banking, I want to stress during this time period, is weak or non-existent. So if you're a peasant, and this is what Dylan was kind of talking about earlier, if you want to borrow money, you basically have to go to a loan shark. If you're a peasant, you want to borrow money, you have to go to someone who's going to charge you outrageous amounts of interest, and if you don't pay it, you're going to lose your land. And a lot of peasants are going to lose their land. You can kind of think about this. How many people here, seriously, how many people ever buy a car with cash? Or pay with their college for cash? Or buy a house with cash? We all have to borrow money. Imagine living in a society where there's no easy way to borrow money. Right? How difficult that would be to do anything. Right? And that's one of the issues that China faces. Okay. So before we continue, remember there's a review quiz coming up this week. It'll open on Friday and close Sunday. It'll be just over the material we talk about. Reading quiz 4 should be, this one's a little bit shorter than usual, but there's 2 of them. There's 2 readings. It's called Shanghai's Lens on the News, and this is looking at an early Chinese newspaper, right? That was developed in the 19th century. And I think it's pretty fun because this is one that looks a lot about how the Chinese used art, right? And how you have this mixture of kind of Western-style lithography with Chinese-style woodblock printing. So that's pretty cool, I think. And it's showing how, and one thing I want to stress, Shanghai, in many ways during this time period that this is looking at, is kind of the cultural and economic capital of China. Beijing is the political capital, but Shanghai is the cultural and economic capital, right? Especially it's a place where new ideas from the West are coming in. So it's showing, in a sense, how Chinese people are absorbing those new ideas. And it shows kind of development from what we saw last week in Pictures to Draw Tears from Iron. Both due by 11:59 p.m. Sunday. We'll start section Wednesday, if not today. So any questions there before we continue? Okay, so we need to now talk about 2 emperors, right? We talked about the Kangxi Emperor. We now need to talk about the Yongzheng Emperor. It's this guy, right? Remember the guy who I emphasized how he presented himself as a Buddhist to Tibetans, right? Kangxi presented himself as a Confucian to Han Chinese to get them to accept his rule. Yongzheng would do similar things, but when he talks to the Tibetans, this is how he presents himself. So, remember, the Kangxi Emperor ruled for like more than 50 years. And the problem was, he probably should have retired. By the end of his life, he was, he just got older and slower. And he just started delegating authority to other people that were not necessarily trustworthy. And so what happened is things were his last few years, things were not being administered very well. And also, he didn't name a successor. Right? He never actually named a successor. He never said who was going to become king after, or emperor after him. And the problem is, of course, he had a lot of kids. There are a lot of people who could claim to be the successor. So what happened is, one of his sons, Yongzheng, found a letter that he said was from Kangxi. So the Kangxi emperor dies. Yongzheng finds a letter and says, oh, the letter says, I'm the next emperor. So people were a little suspicious. Actually, it's probably correct. It probably is true that he was the next emperor. But people were kind of like, I don't know about that. But in any case, Yongzheng will become the next emperor. And the Qing dynasty in China were very lucky because this guy was a really, really good emperor in many respects. Right? He was a really good emperor. First of all, he had to restore the government after lots of neglect. Right? For the last decade or so, as Kangxi aged, he didn't do that good a job. He just trusted people who were like flattering him to govern, and they didn't really do a good job. But he's going to restore the government after lots of neglect. And one reason he's able to do this, he was a very careful administrator. He spent so much time on paperwork. Right? He spent so much time on paperwork, trying to make sure that everyone had good guidance. Remember how the Wanli emperor was disconnected from his officials, and that led them not to care about their jobs? This guy was connected to his officials. If you wrote him with a problem, he would sit down and advise you about how to deal with your problem. And he was a smart guy and would give you good advice. So he did a very good job, right? You want someone who's administrating something like an empire to be very careful. He will also actually engage with some success with tax reforms. He will actually start getting the gentry to pay taxes, or more taxes, I should say. Now I say limited success. You're never going to have complete success with taxes. People always figure out a way to get out of paying taxes. But he will meet with some limited success. And it lasts for as long as he lives. And then it will go back. It's just very difficult to get those darn gentry to start paying money. This is, by the way, one reason why the communists will eliminate the gentry. Right? One reason what will happen when the communists take power, the peasants will help them, and part of the deal is they get rid of the gentry and they redistribute the gentry's land to the peasants. Right? This will work for a while, but especially after he dies, it'll go back to being this kind of balance between the gentry and this government. One reason also he has to let off is, remember how we talked about expansionism? Remember we talked about how the Qing have this problem, and China in general, and any land empire has a problem? You have to keep expanding, because otherwise you're just going to start contracting. There's no clear border. So he's always engaged in border wars. And because of that, he needs money, and if he makes the gentry too angry and they rebel, then he has to, spend money putting down that rebellion. So he wants to push taxes somewhat. He'll meet with limited success, but because he doesn't want rebellion, he can't push too hard. Being an emperor is all about balance in a sense, right? Squeeze the gentry enough to get some money out of them, but don't squeeze them too hard so they rebel and they stop working with you. One other cool thing about him, he's kind of like the Abraham Lincoln of the Qing emperors, because he's going to issue kind of his own Emancipation Proclamation. It's not the ending of slavery, but in this time period that were what were called mean people, and I don't mean like mean like nasty, I mean like base, like lower class, who were considered kind of dirty and did not have the rights that common Chinese people had. These were people often who lived on boats. They were like boat people, or they were people who engaged in they were like butchers. They cut up meat. They usually had dirty jobs, and people looked down on them. And there was legal discrimination against them, and he got rid of it all. So he's remembered fondly in many ways by Chinese people, because this guy was a good emperor, right, who tried to really rule for the good of the people, and that helped keep the Qing Empire going. Dylan, you had a question?
Does that actually last through his... Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, that one actually worked. That was more popular than the whole... No one wants to pay taxes. But some people do like liberation, so it worked there. Now, unfortunately for Qin Wong, you'll notice the bad thing is that when your dad rules for a really, really long time, is you can't rule for a very long time because you're old when you become emperor. So he was old when he became emperor. He only ruled for about 12 years, and that's why we don't talk about him as much. But I do have to emphasize, this guy knew what he was doing, and that helped put the Qing on a secure foundation. Right? That helped put them on a secure foundation so their empire is able to continue. And that brings us to Qin Wong, who's really, really, really important. In part because look how long he was emperor for. Wow. He actually could have, if I recall correctly, he could have been emperor longer, but he retired because he didn't think it was right for him to rule longer than his grandfather. Right? The kind of filial piety there. Under him, Chinese expansion will continue. This is when the territory of Xinjiang will come under Chinese rule. And this is important. This is when they conquer a large number of Muslim people who are related to Turks. So they look a lot different from Chinese, your traditional Han Chinese people. And this is I want to mention this because this is a big deal today, because this is where there's people there who don't want to be part of China, who say we want to break away. And so this is an area where there's a lot of kind of contention and some international news on. But this is when it comes under Qing rule. Right, so we're going to expand. And I apologize, this video works right fine in my office. It doesn't work here. I don't know why. It doesn't demand a subscription in my office. It does demand a subscription here. But I was going to show you a video about Islam in China. And it basically was talking about how Chinese women were often left in charge of Chinese mosques. Right? So in China, women tend to have a little bit more influence in the Islamic faith than they would in other parts of the Islamic world. But unfortunately, that video didn't work. So normally we would have had a break here, and I would stop talking, but we can't, so I apologize. But what happens under Qin Wong? The hard work of Kangxi and Yongzheng has led to a prosperous, stable China. Right? Remember, Kangxi had to deal with these rebellions. Yongzheng is working to carry out a lot of administrative work. Together, they have made a China that is increasingly prosperous, and that will lead to more and more culture. So to give you an example of this, in the first year of Qin Wong's reign, they had a 24 million tael surplus. Remember, a tael is an ounce of silver. So the government had 24 million ounces of silver that they knew what to do with. Right? So to give you an idea, they had, wow, go really far back. They have 24 million of these things that they don't know what to do with. That's pretty cool. This is a what's that?
Save it.
Well, that's what they'll do.
Day.
That's what they're going to do. They're going to save it. They'll use it for conquest eventually, but they're going to save it there. That's really awesome. And remember how I said, this is why they don't want to push the gentry, right? We've got enough money. We've got more money than we know what to do with. Let's not push these guys. Let's just keep the course. This is one reason why China's not going to innovate in the way that we might expect, because they're doing quite well. Europeans will innovate because they're not doing as well. In 1786, that went up to 70 million. So now we have 70 million of those coins that we don't know what to do with. That's a really good situation to be in. And imagine this, during his reign, he canceled annual taxes 4 years. Can you imagine that? If the President of the United States would say, the economy's so good, guess what? You don't have to pay taxes this year. That would be awesome. Right? That would be great.
You get reelected immediately.
Exactly.
Any president would.
Oh yeah. Especially if you did it all 4 years, right? 4 years in a row. So this is astounding. So the Qing is becoming wealthier during this time period. They just have more money than they know what to do with. And by the way, in the exams, I'm not going to ask you for exact numbers. I give you these numbers so you can see what I'm talking about. Right? So when you understand when I say they got richer, this is how rich. And the population would go up 70%. And one thing we have to emphasize, we tend to equate high population with poverty. But in this time period, high population means things are going well. More people means more workers, means more food, and more people making stuff. So usually in pre-modern civilizations, they're usually actually underpopulated. So when things are good, their population goes up. Right? That's what's happening here. So that's a sign of things being good and getting better. Now, as I mentioned, the conquest will continue, and that's a lot of where that money goes to. Right? It's going to go to conquering, expanding the Qing Empire. Now, one thing about Qin Wong is very interesting, though, is that he is very concerned about his own legitimacy. And I want to highlight this. There are still some Chinese who do not like the Manchus and who write things about them secretly. And during Yongzheng's reign, there was actually a guy who tried to launch a rebellion against the Qing, saying, we don't want these dirty barbarians ruling us. So even after all the good work, in a sense, the Qing had done, and even though most Chinese people accepted the Qing, there was still anti-Qing feeling. There was still anti-Manchu feeling. We don't want to be governed by these guys. We want to be governed by Han Chinese. So because of that, Qin Long was very much concerned with his legitimacy and engaged in policies of censorship. So for example, some Buddhists wrote things he didn't like, so he banned their writings. Similarly, in 1768, there was this thing called the Sorcerer's Scare. I had the year wrong, I apologize. Annie would have corrected me, so I'm glad I caught myself. But there was actually kind of like a Salem, you know how the Salem witch trial? This was kind of the Chinese equivalent, where there was this scare, there were sorcerers going around, and they were stealing people's souls, and this was going to lead to a rebellion. So the Qinlong Emperor came down hard on this, right? This was actually a very small scale incident, but the emperor himself was freaked out by it because of this fear over legitimacy, fear that some people were challenging the Manchu. One thing that I think is particularly striking is he goes after Catholicism. And I say that's striking because there weren't that many Catholics. Right? This time period in China, the number of Catholics were just a few 100,000. That's nothing in a country of hundreds of millions. Right? But there's a problem. The Catholics have a dispute, a theological dispute. Remember how I said that you're supposed to respect your ancestors and like you offer them food and wine after they die? Well, is that worship? You're kneeling down in front of them and you're offering them food and wine. And the Catholics weren't sure. The Jesuits talked to educated Chinese people and said, is this worship? Do you think the spirits actually come down and eat the food? And the educated people said, no. It's all symbolic. It's cool. You can do it. You're not worshiping the ancestors. Then the Dominicans and Franciscans, other Catholics, asked the peasants, the common people, do the ancestors come down and eat the food? And the peasants are like, they totally do it. If you don't do it, the ancestors are going to be mad. And that will lead to you being cursed and stuff like that. So the Catholics couldn't get a straight answer. So rather than accidentally commit the sin of idolatry, the Pope said, Catholics, you can't do this. Don't do these ancestor rites. And the Chinese emperor wasn't very happy about that. Because he's like, well, who are you to tell my people what to do? I'm the emperor, not you. And I think these rituals are just fine. I think people should do them because they encourage filial piety. And this Pope over far away in this barbarian land called Italy, who's he to tell me what to do? So Qin Long was not very happy about this. And this called into question the loyalty of Catholics. Should they be loyal to the Pope first or to their emperor? And remember, the Chinese were obsessed, I should say, let me start over. Remember, Chinese political theory held that you used ritual to govern. And Catholics are being told there's a ritual you're not supposed to undertake. So this is going to lead to the persecution and execution of some Catholics. And it will go from being a good religion, remember Kangxi said it was a good religion, it will be said to be a bad religion now. And curiously, to give you another example, if we do a comparison, if you're familiar with French history, you may have heard of the Encyclopedia that's written in the 18th century by like Voltaire and all those guys. And this was a encyclopedia of knowledge that challenged authority. But Qin Wong will assemble his own encyclopedia, and he wants everyone to turn in all these different writings to make this huge encyclopedia. And it sounds really great. It sounds like he's sponsoring culture, but also he decides some things should not be allowed in the encyclopedia, and some writing should just be banned completely. So he wants to assemble knowledge in order to make sure that any knowledge that criticizes the Manchu or the Qing will be destroyed. Right? This will lead to the destruction of books and knowledge. So complex guy. Right? He wants to make sure that the Qing will stay in power. He's afraid of them being challenged. So he really wants to focus on this. But in any case, stability, European knowledge, and crops in the Americas are going to lead to population growth, trade, urbanization, increased wealth, and culture. The 18th century in China is a good time to be alive. Right? Especially if we look at other parts of the world during this time period. Now, and to give you an idea of the kind of confidence that the Chinese have and their ability to change things, I want to talk about something that happens. This happened earlier, but the Qing are going to have to refix it, redo this. But here's the thing. In China, you've got some good west to east rivers. Right? There's the Yellow River in the north and the Yangtze in the south. These rivers are good if you want to go from here to here. But what if you want to go north-south? The Chinese do not have a Mississippi River. Right? You know, in American history, right, the Mississippi River is so important for helping to unify our country. So the Chinese say, well, you know what? Let's just build a river. We have this good east-west river. We have this good east-west river. So let's build a river all the way down here from Hangzhou, all the way up here to Beijing. And they pulled it off. Right? They're able to build this river. And I have a clip I'm going to play for you, and it's going to talk about this and how it changes China. Oh, there we go. Oh, thank you.
By the time China was under the rule of the Qing dynasty, the approach to water conservancy projects had become more scientific. There were, for example, new scientific instruments for determining the speed, volume, and level of water. There was a thirst for new scientific knowledge and technology. And this was not just a desire felt by individuals. The Qing government knew it was essential for building up the country. Toward the end of the 17th century, a mathematics studio was established in Changchun Garden in the old Summer Palace. It was the National Research Center for Mathematics in the China of its time. The Qing imperial court went to great efforts to promote the study of mathematics, and a number of fine mathematicians emerged as a result. Some of them compiled major works such as The Essence of Mathematical Principles. In its quest to promote the use of mathematics, the Mathematics Studio bought books on advanced mathematics from abroad and even engaged Western teachers.
So Jesuit, of course.
This encyclopedia of mathematics covered the field at the highest level of the age. It contains all the main achievements of mathematics that had been introduced to China, as well as China's own classical works on the subject. This work reveals an enthusiasm to take on new knowledge and a willingness of the Chinese of the era to assimilate advances made by other nations in science and culture.
Euclid, again.
所以这整个清代的话，康熙是非常重要的，因为他是想通过学习西学来达到管理国家的一个目的。他就希望组织一批人来学习科学，然后呢，他说我们学会了以后呢，他就希望以后我们不再依赖这个外国人。所以对康熙来说，他是有一个非常强的这个独立的这个自主的一个这么一个心态。
All right. So what happens then? The Grand Canal is actually quite old. I believe it was built first in like the 7th century, so it's very old. But it had fallen under disrepair during the Ming Dynasty. Remember, the Ming Dynasty was running out of money, didn't have much money, so this thing kind of fell apart and it didn't work well anymore. The Qing are going to rebuild it and improve it using, again, Western knowledge, right? And you can kind of, math, it may not seem, math doesn't necessarily seem immediately practical when you're learning geometry. But if you want to design a canal or improve it, knowing geometry is pretty darn useful, right? Engineering absolutely depends on geometry. So again, using this Western knowledge, in part brought by the Jesuits, the Qing are able to not only rebuild this great canal, but also to make it even better, to innovate. And that's going to help improve, of course, their economy, right? Infrastructure, good transport, makes trade easier, makes the economy better. Though, by the way, one reason it connects to Beijing is to bring up food for the court in Beijing to have. But in any case, it still helps business. I just wanted to highlight this. These are people working on the Grand Canal. You have to mobilize a lot of people to work on something that big. Now, here's the thing. I don't know if the Kangxi Emperor actually said that. That was kind of a weird thing, but maybe he did say it. But the last statement of the scholar never comes to fruition. The Chinese will continue to use Western scholars, typically these Jesuit missionaries, in order to help them to do all these things. So again, the Chinese are willing to be open to learning new ideas. But in this time period, they're not so much interested in innovation. In a sense, I would argue the Chinese were too practical, right? They don't see the interest in pure science or pure math. It's always applied. Right? It's always applied math and applied science. So once they deal with the river problem, great, we fixed it. We don't need to go any further. Let's just stop there. Right? We're just going to stop there. So this is kind of a problem, right? We can see it clearly. They couldn't see it at the time. But what this means is the Chinese will not try and develop science for science's sake. Right? So they're not going to have a scientific revolution. They're going to learn about science and apply it. They say, okay, this is great. We'll just stop there at the applied part. And in part, I think this has to do with moral knowledge being considered more valuable than scientific knowledge. Right? So the joke, like, if I tell someone I'm a PhD, they're like, oh, you're not a real doctor. Right? Real doctor is medical knowledge because they do stuff. In ancient China, it was reversed. Right? A doctor, that's just a technician. A PhD, that's someone who really has it together because they know moral knowledge. Right? So China emphasized moral knowledge over scientific knowledge. And so if you're really, really smart, you're not going to go into this. You're going to study the exams, you're going to study Confucianism, become an official. Right? They never encouraged science the way, say, Great Britain did through the Royal Society. Right? In Britain, the king will form this Royal Society where people are rewarded, given prizes and honors for being good scientists and coming up with useful knowledge. In China, there's no such thing. However, I'm not trying to be too critical of the Chinese because who would have seen this, right? They didn't necessarily see it coming. It's hard to see it coming. But this still represents openness. The Chinese are still willing to be open and to learn from the West. And I want to show you, okay, first of all, I want to stress one thing that's difficult about history, especially taking a 300-level history class. I'm going to tell you about something today, and then like in 3 or 4 weeks, I'm going to refer back to it, right? Just to make things complicated. But I do have a reason, and you'll understand it better then. But there's a place near Beijing called Yuanmingyuan, which means the Garden of Perfect Brightness. This is the summer palace. Beijing is incredibly hot. And so this is a palace. It's a little bit further north where it's a little cooler and it's higher altitude. So when it got too hot, this is where the emperor would go. And you can see this place is huge, right? This has multiple lakes in it. This, by the way, is a Buddhist temple. If you see a swastika, but it's at an angle, then it's a Nazi swastika. But when it's flat, it's a Buddhist swastika, just so you know. But this thing is huge, right? This is an amazing palace. And this is a drawing of the palace, the inside. But I just want to note, this isn't Chinese-style art, is it? This is Western-style art. This was drawn by a Jesuit missionary in China. So a Jesuit missionary visited this place. And now this is Chinese-style art, but you can see there's the emperors playing with their many, many children, right? They have many wives, they have many kids, right? There they are playing with their children. And I want to show you this kind of life of the emperors. But here's the cool thing, and you actually saw this in that video clip. This is the Observatory of Lands Beyond, called the Fengwei Guan. Notice, that doesn't look like a Chinese building, does it? This was something that was created by the emperor's request by those Jesuit missionaries. So they're bringing Western architecture into China. And the Chinese like it. They think it's cool. Right? They say, yes, please build us one of these beautiful places. And notice, it's an observatory. It's a place for astronomy. So not only are the Chinese embracing Western-style architecture, they're also embracing this kind of Western knowledge. We want to learn about astronomy. And this is, I think, fun. This is Qin Wong. And remember how I said that the Manchus had to emphasize that they were martial, that they were like good hunters as part of their identity? That's what he's doing. That's the Chinese emperor, the one we've been talking about who ruled for so long, as a hunter and a warrior. But again, does that look like Chinese style art? Painted by a Jesuit. Right? And the emperor loved this. Right? The emperor thought this was really cool. This is one of my favorites. This is an attempt by a Chinese artist to draw the Yongcheng emperor dressed as a Western person. So this is where things are getting mixed. Right? Chinese style art, but the emperor's Western. He's wearing a wig. Right? And he's wearing like the kind of, what are the culottes? Right? So very interesting stuff. And he's hunting a tiger with a sword. That's pretty martial, isn't it? I mean, I'm not sure I wouldn't want to do it, but I'd rather hunt a tiger with arrows, not with a trident. Right? But it's trying to emphasize how powerful this guy is. And you could also see that this went the other way. Right? This went the other way. In the 18th century, a man named William Chambers, who's going to be knighted, will write a book about how to garden like the Chinese do in Europe. There will be many Western people who look at China and say, China is awesome. Right? China is awesome. China is amazing. There's a lot we can learn from China. Voltaire loves China. And we'll talk about how great China is. So in the 18th century, there's an openness in China. There's also an openness in the West. Right? There's this mutual respect. Right? Western people are saying, we could learn how to garden better, how to build beautiful things from the Chinese. And later on, though, this will happen. Right? Later on, we'll have this kind of situation. This is very different. Right? This is a Western drawing looking down on the Chinese. The Chinese emperor symbolizes China. Too big, unable to deal with the problems that it faces, immobile. Right? So this is what's going to happen. Now, one thing I want to stress that we see in the Qing during this period is there's this feeling among Chinese that this is the best that things can get. And you can see this through literature. There's something called The Dream of the Red Chamber. And this is a book. It's been translated into English if you're interested in this. And it's the story of a wealthy extended family. So remember how the good earth focused on peasants? This focuses on the gentry. It's all about the gentry. And it's basically, it's a huge story, but the major story is a tragic love story. It's about a man and woman who fall in love, but despite their great wealth and power, they cannot marry. So it ends with the woman killing herself, and the man passes the exams. He will study and passes the exams, become a high official, but will decide not to do so, and will instead become a wandering ascetic. Will give up the life of luxury. And so it's a fascinating story. I mean, it's just, like I said, it's a tragic love story. But what's interesting about it, first of all, it's very patriarchal. It's all about it's this, I don't want to be crude, but it's this male fantasy where the woman's loyal, the guy's loyal, but he still has sex with all these different women, including servants who really can't say no, so it's kind of creepy. But it's, about these guys who live in absolute luxury and have just lots and lots and lots of sex. And they also have the wealth, power, and prestige to flaunt the law. This family is actually really nasty. They kill people and then cover it up because they have so much money and power. But what I think is fascinating about this book correctly identifies some of the problems in Chinese society, right? This problem with people who are too wealthy and use that wealth to have political power. It does, even though it's very patriarchal in many ways, it does highlight the problem women face. But the only thing they can think to do is to leave, right? The woman kills herself, the man becomes a wandering ascetic. The world is what it is, we can't actually change it, right? There's no idea of change, right? This is just the way the world is. So in a sense, there's so much, China has done so well that people look at its problems and just say, can't do anything about it. That will change in the 19th and 20th centuries, but that's a story we'll have to tell later. I'll see you all on Wednesday. And we will start section 4 on Wednesday. Apologize for lecturing so long. I wanted that video to work, and darn it, didn't want to work.
You have to look it up.
Oh, I need to stop my recording.